Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and loads of love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I am doing fine, thank you very much, and I just love hearing from you, and all the things that you drink is just absolutely unbelievable. It blows the mind. I mean, half these things I've never heard of before, like incredible teas from Kenya and things like that. My word. So don't forget to get that lovely quintessential drink. And if you are drinking something that I've never heard of before, please let me know. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Chanel, and I'm from rural Montana. And when I say rural, I mean rural quite literally. I was raised as a single child in a remote utopian, unspoilt part of the world. I grew up in the early 80s in a very pastoral, rustic-style country home surrounded by the exquisite countryside that consisted of mountainous valleys, statuesque rugged outcrops, open prairies, silvery streams, and vast areas of natural wood green that was primarily made up of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, many that were so magnificent and some over at least 100 foot tall. I adored the wood green and all the horse-riding trails that smelt so refreshing with the nostalgic, sweet, uplifting scent of pine that was so reminiscent of Christmas to me. Our snug home was unremarkable, as it was a standard symmetrical home with 2 stories and whitewashed walls, with a green slate roof, sizable bay windows and green shutters, but it served our immediate purposes. It was comfortable and cosy, with generous-sized open fireplaces and parquet wooden flooring throughout, with a magnificent sweeping staircase that led up to the 2nd floor. Yet, despite the simplicity of our home, it really did look as pretty as a picture, as the sprawling verdant countryside served to elevate its physical aesthetic appeal, as it would be exceedingly difficult for anything to look ugly amidst such mesmerizing, resplendent beauty. We possessed a couple of red barns on our land for storage purposes and a sizable stable block that could house 8 horses that always smelt of leather and hay. We were the fortunate owners of 2 very friendly American quarter horses called Laura Ashley and Lavender Sky, a rambunctious, mischievous Scottish terrier called Scotty, who was completely devoted to my mother and followed her everywhere, and a very intelligent, sprightly and friendly pot-belly pig that we called Leftover. He put on weight at a rapid pace because my mother would give him all our scraps, which was marvellous because we didn't have to have a garbage disposal, as Leftover did a sensational job in gobbling up everything that we didn't want. I had a particularly good relationship with Leftover because at dinner time the pig would hide outside the dining room window in high expectation of a tasty morsel, and he knew that he needed to remain very still and quiet or his cover would be blown, and Leftover would do virtually anything for food, so you could train him very easily. My mother would never ever let me have dessert until I'd eaten every last morsel on my plate. She was very strict about that. So the moment her back was turned, I would open the window, while my father would sneakily keep her preoccupied, while I would throw out all the food and give it to Leftover, who would be absolutely delighted to receive it. My mother was a nutritionist, and dinner was never that tasty, because quite frankly, there is a limit to how exciting a vegan nut loaf is going to be, to a staunch carnivore that likes meats and potatoes, much like the likes of my father and myself. Thankfully, my mother was none the wiser about our clever little arrangement. My father and I often went to the local diner for dinner to avoid some of my mother's meals and to enjoy a nice, juicy, succulent steak together, and he often brought me a secret stash of snacks, which I hid at the bottom of my dresser, and this went on for many years without my mother ever finding out about it. Growing up, we lived quite far away from the local town, and there was an uneven, granular road we called the Long, Lonely Road, that was known for being rugged, stony and precipitous. In truth, you did not want to get stuck on that craggy road, because help was unlikely to come your way, and more than likely you would probably have to walk back home all on your own. In those days we didn't have cell phones, yet even today people have been trapped on that road and unable to get cell phone reception because the connections are atrocious. Suffice to say that dusty road is still poorly maintained and was always referred to as the Long Lonely Road, and at best you might spot a lone fox crossing your path, or even a few elk or a black bear. But a human passing by in a car is less likely to be seen, as the road is used rather sparingly by the residents in the area, who possibly take a trip to the local town only once a week at the most to stock up on supplies, even though my family was more inclined to use it regularly. My story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in the early fall of 1982, when I was a young 16-year-old girl at the time. One weekend, my parents received a phone call from my uncle saying that my aunt had been taken seriously ill with some mysterious illness that the doctors were simply unable to diagnose, and things were looking seriously grave for her because she was going downhill very fast, and my mother, who was close to her sister, asked me if I didn't mind manning the fort while they were away. "I need to see my sister," she told me with tears in her eyes. "She's always been so healthy, bless her soul. But your father and I ought to spend some time with her over the next couple of days. I'll be taking Scotty with us, as there's nothing like a dog to help a sick person get better, and you know how much your aunt adores little Scotty. You don't mind being on your own, do you, dear?" "I'll be fine," I assured my mother. "Don't you worry about me. I'll look after the horses and leftover, and I'll also take care of absolutely everything." "Good girl," said my mother, planting a kiss on my forehead. "I knew I could depend on you." Did I mind? Of course not. It would be great fun to be on my own. And so when my parents had left, I surreptitiously called my boyfriend Duncan to tell him the great news and to ask him to come and stay with me so we could have the whole house to ourselves. For when the cat's away, the mice do play, let's not kid. I remember how disappointed he sounded on the phone when he promptly informed me that he was going away with his family for the weekend on a camping trip, which was a real bummer. My heart sank, as I was so hoping we could spend the weekend together. I then phoned my best girlfriend Pansy, but she was also busy over the weekend, so I was well and truly stuck on my own. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and I had fed the horses and also left over our potbelly pig, who was now bursting at the seams from all the healthy food my mother had left me in the fridge for me to consume. I was making myself a hot cup of cocoa when I suddenly realised that our cookie jar was completely empty. I was really feeling like a delicious chocolate chip cookie, and all that was left was a scattering of crumbs at the bottom of the tin. Damn, I thought. I felt like some chocolate, and the urge was so strong for me that I could not stop thinking about it. No wonder they say that sugar addiction is equivalent to cocaine, because I just knew I needed to get to town to stock up on cookies fast. Over the years I've learnt to drive quite well, as my father had taught me how to drive when I was as young as 11. But I confess I didn't have a driving licence, but my mother's car was parked in the bay, and what she didn't know would never hurt her. I promptly found some spare cash and my mother's car keys, and I climbed into the driver's seat and off I went. It made me feel remarkably grown up, leaving our premises in the car and driving through our cattle gate to make the 45-minute trip to the local town. I had a growing list in my head of what I would be buying that got progressively larger and larger as I approached the town. I fancied some chocolate chip cookies. That would be nice. And how about some fresh doughnuts and some salted barbecue chips? The list began to grow again. Then I began to salivate, as I thought all about the delicious chocolate I would eventually be enjoying. It was very rough driving on that long, lonely, precipitous country road, and my mother's bright red Ford Mustang wasn't easy to manoeuvre at all. It jolted and wobbled as random stones began beating against the car's underbelly. It was certainly a precarious journey, to say the least, but I didn't care about any of that, for at the end of my journey lay a colourful, enticing rainbow with a delectable chocolate chip cookie at the end of it, and what could be better than that? I managed to get to the small town and surreptitiously parked my car in a very discreet place under a large oak tree, as I didn't want to be observed by any of the town locals, as I was well acquainted with most of the people here. Imagine my extreme annoyance when, whilst in the store, I just happened to bump into Miss Ivor Miller, who could be a nightmare at the very best of times and was without doubt the quintessential town busybody. Just my luck. Why, of all the people that I had to bump into, it had to be Ivor Miller. She was the first person I would have sooner avoided. Ivor Miller was a well-rounded, stout woman in her early 60s, with short curly hazelnut hair and brown beady eyes that always gave you the distinct impression that she had X-ray vision, because you felt like she missed nothing and was studying you as intently as an eagle that scans its prey. "Hello, Chanel," she said, regarding my less-than-healthy basket with a fervent interest and intrigue. It was obviously overflowing with chocolates and snacks, and everything we're always told never to eat. I could tell Ivor looked quite thrilled to have quite literally caught me with my pants down, in a manner of speaking, as buying crap, especially as my mother's daughter, did not look good for her resume as a highly acclaimed dietitian with a formidable reputation behind her, and she was always quick to boast about the healthy food she claimed her family enjoyed, and was simply clueless about how much of it actually ended up in the stomach of our pot-bellied pig. Her guiltless shopping trolley was a quintessential example of cutting-edge whole food living at its finest, and was always filled with impressive packages of lentils, beans, vegetables and brown bread, whilst mine was overloaded with all this sinful but delectable stuff that, if my mother were to witness, would quite literally make her squirm with horror. "You look like you're about to have a lovely feast," she said. "I must admit I've never seen your family buy anything unhealthy before. Of course, with your mother's illustrious reputation as a dietitian." "Well, I just felt like a little chocolate," I said, guiltily flushing red with embarrassment. "Where is your mother?" she asked. "I don't see her around anywhere." "Oh, she's back at the car," I lied. "Poor thing, she's got a terrible migraine headache." "A migraine headache?" piped Ivor. "You shouldn't be buying chocolate for migraines. Do you know it's the worst thing for your mother to be eating? But I think she should know that, being a dietitian, of course." "The chocolates aren't for her," I said. "They're for me." "I see," said Ivor. "Your secret's safe with me, but you better not eat it all at once or you'll be very sick." "Should I go and have a word with your mother?" she said. "It could cheer her up to see me." "Absolutely not, Ivor," I told her. "When Mum has migraines, she doesn't want to see anyone. She's very, very self-conscious, especially without her makeup on, and her hair's messed up. And besides, she's still only wearing her pyjamas." "Like I worry about all that," said Ivor. "I'm not that shallow, you know. I don't care what she looks like. I think I'll go and have a word with her. It'll do her good to have some adult company. And I can quiz her about what's really going on with all those naughty chocolates you're buying." "No," I said, raising my voice. "You can't do that, Ivor. My mother doesn't want to see you. I'm sorry, but she doesn't want to see anyone." "Oh, dear," said Ivor. "Very well, if you put it like that. Oh, by the way, do tell your mother that Mrs. Jenkins has lost her horse American Pie. You know the one. She was about to ride her, but she bolted off as something spooked her very badly. She could be anywhere now, so do keep an eye open for her. I'm helping her put signs all over the town, offering a reward for anyone who can find the horse." "I'll tell her," I said hurriedly, making my way quickly back to my mother's car, glancing over my shoulders to check that I wasn't being stalked by Ivor. Damn that woman, I thought. That was close. What if she asks my mother about her erroneous migraine headaches, when my mother doesn't even get migraines? What then? If my mother were to ever find out that I'd been driving her car without a licence, I would be in heaps of trouble. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind, as I did not want to concern myself with those issues. Well, not now, anyway. I got back into the Ford Mustang, and before long I was travelling down the long, lonely road, and then quite suddenly my car just stopped. I tried to start up the engine, and then I groaned. Oh, no! What an idiot, I thought. My mother's car has completely run out of gas, and I was literally miles away from the town, and also miles away from my home. I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was a guarantee that no car would be driving down this road any time soon, hence its formidable reputation as the long, lonely road. It wasn't called that for nothing. I slammed my head on the steering wheel and let out a few annoyed screams, and I banged my hand on the horn, blowing it a few times in my heightened level of frustration. Oh no! What an idiot I was! How stupid did I have to be not to observe the gas gauge flashing away? There was no choice to the matter. I'd have to walk home, and it would be a long, drawn-out, arduous trek, but I was short of any options. I either stayed here for well over 48 hours or possibly more, or I made the trek home, and it wasn't a difficult decision for me to have to make. I quickly opened my mother's trunk and retrieved the spare anorak and a torch, and then gathered one of my shopping bags with chips and biscuits and proceeded to walk the long distance home. I decided to turn down one of the horse trails that led through the wooded area, as it was a shortcut, but I was secretly cursing that I wasn't wearing better shoes. There was a great deal of treefall, and the ground was thickly covered in leaves and twigs, and after trekking for what seemed like an age, darkness eventually descended over the whole valley, and there was a distinct chill in the air, and I began to shiver, so I swiftly put on my mother's anorak. Even though I could see clearly, I was frequently stumbling over rocks, and on one occasion I took a fall and slid over a sandy patch and inadvertently managed to twist my ankle. Luckily no real harm was done. Yes, it hurt slightly, but it wasn't too bad. But I did feel as if I was walking forever, and that there would be no end in sight. When would I ever get home, I wondered? This whole thing was an absolute nightmare, and my longing for a chocolate chip cookie had long since subsided, as all my focus was to get home in one piece without being mauled by a wild animal, because cougars and bears were very common in these parts. It was a glorious night, although I failed to see its beauty, as I was so overcome with a heightened anxiety. I truly did not like being alone in the darkness, and it was getting cold, but the vast firmament that stretched above me, filled with a myriad of tiny silvery glittering stars, made me feel very inconspicuous, vulnerable and small, much like a tiny little ant. How I wished with all my heart that I wasn't on my own. I could hear the chirping crickets and the croaking frogs and the distant howls of coyotes and wolves. All of a sudden I also discerned the sound of heavy footfall that seemed to be stalking me, and my heart suddenly began to thunder through my chest, and I could feel chills of terror prickling down my spine. I knew better than to run, for no one should ever run from a predator, but I still speeded up my walk, and noted that the feet behind me also increased their pace. When I stopped, so did they, and when I moved forwards, the feet began to move too. I could sense that I was definitely being followed, and it was by an apex predator. I'm not sure how I knew this, but I just did. It was without doubt a powerful, pretentious presence that was following me, but what it was, I could not imagine. But it sounded like this being was walking on 2 feet and not 4, but I was sure that I had to be mistaken about that. I kept warily glancing cautiously over my shoulders, so nervously, trying to see if I could discern an animal stealthily shadowing me, but nothing was ever there. "Hello," I shouted. "Is anybody there?" But I was met with an inauspicious sound of silence. "Hello? Hello? Is anybody around?" Again, silence. All of a sudden something began to throw pebbles at me, and I turned around, and then moving towards me was a large critter on 2 feet. I was so dumbfounded and speechless by what I was seeing, because this creature was so unorthodox and idiosyncratic. Indeed, it was so outlandish and peculiar that I was literally too startled to even react. As strange as it sounds, I was so overcome with such astonishment that I think my fear dissipated, although clearly I should have been terribly afraid, given this creature's gargantuan proportions. But looking back, I believe my angst was suppressed by the sheer enigma of seeing something so out of alignment and so incongruous with everything I thought I knew. I had never heard of a creature like this ever existing in North America before. This experience quite literally turned my view of the natural world completely upside down, to such an extent that I am open to believing almost anything is possible, and am far less cynical than I ever used to be. At a conservative estimate, I would say the creature was approximately about 9 foot tall. It was covered in long, flowing dark hair, but what colour it was I couldn't directly discern, because it was too dark for that. It possessed very overlong arms that travelled below the knees, and his sturdy, agile legs were significantly shorter to its arms by contrast, although they were strong and powerful. I'd recently seen a documentary on gorillas, and the creature with its broad-barreled chest, powerful shoulders, not to mention its pyramid-shaped head, rather reminded me of those mountain gorillas in the programme I had watched. But at the same time, this creature was significantly different. It had an incredibly human shape to its face that rather reminded me of a ruggedly handsome man, while its deep-set dark eyes seemed very intelligent and kind. The creature had a sweet musky smell that rather reminded me of the sweat after a workout, but it wasn't offensive in any way. I stood there like a complete lemon, staring at the creature in horror, not knowing how to react. I was somewhat perplexed and befuddled, as this creature kept indicating for me to follow him, using signals not unsimilar to a human's. I can assure you I had absolutely no intention of following him, so I quickly turned around and proceeded to walk away, doing my level best to ignore the creature, but he was not going to put up with my complete disregard of him, and promptly threw a scattering of pebbles at me to get my attention again. I quickly turned around, and he again began indicating for me to follow him. He pointed and then made the perfect imitation of a horse that was whinnying. I was astonished, as why was this creature making a horse noise? He made the noise again and again, and kept pointing. I don't know why, but something compelled me to follow him, and that was when I saw Mrs. Jenkins' horse, whom I knew very well. It was American Pie, and she was standing behind a large thorny briar, and was fully saddled and eating the grass with her reins and bridle still intact. She looked up when she saw me, and trotted over to me so happily, and was as delighted to see me as I was indeed to see her. I put my arms lovingly around her and stroked her mane. I knew I could ride her back home, so things were really looking up, and the relief I felt was completely overwhelming. I could not abide walking for so many miles at a time, surrounded by darkness, and being afraid of all the dark, looming shadows between the trees, and the unsettling feeling that eyes were watching me. I nodded at the creature to say thanks for leading me to American Pie, and promptly ran towards him and handed him my plastic bag full of goodies that I no longer cared about any more. It was the least I could do to say thank you. The creature grabbed the bag with the enthusiasm of a monkey. He was so excited that he behaved like a kid at Christmas, opening his Christmas stocking. Indeed, he was so thrilled that he began to chatter away frenziedly, and fanned out all my shopping over the ground to examine it very carefully. He sniffed each individual packet curiously, and then selected one to open. It was the chocolate chip cookies, and he scattered them everywhere, and began to eat them. And I could see by the joyous expression on his face that he really enjoyed the taste of those delicious cookies, and who could blame him, for they were very good. I mounted American Pie and began to trot down the hiking trail that I knew exceedingly well, and on his back I felt safe and secure, despite being in the dark with the cold wind blowing against my face. I began to enjoy my ride. I waved at the creature while he nodded at me, his mouth now crammed full of cookies. After trotting for a while, I was amazed to see the creature running beside me, and in his hands he held out an eagle's feather towards me, which at the time I thought was exceedingly odd, but now I realised he was gifting me. I watched him, armed with my shopping bag in his hands, glide past us with the speed and grace of a cheetah, and he was gone from our sight in the opposite direction towards the mountains. I noted that American Pie wasn't at all unsettled by the creature. Finally I arrived at home, and I was never more pleased to be back to the place where I felt reassured and invulnerable. I placed American Pie in our stable blocks next to my other 2 horses, and put a horse blanket over her body, and fed her with oats, molasses, maize and vegetables, along with some chopped up apple and carrot, and she was one very happy horse. When I returned to the house, I promptly phoned Mrs. Jenkins to tell her that I'd found her horse, and that she could collect her in the morning, and I could tell that she was in tears over the phone, as her relief was immense. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins arrived at my house at the crack of dawn with her husband in her jeep, with the horse trailer. I'd always liked her, as she was an easy-going, fun-loving woman who wore her heart on her sleeve. On this particular occasion, she was wearing her blue riding jodhpurs, a white shirt, a tweed jacket, along with her riding hat and boots. I'll never forget how she ran over to her beloved horse with tears pouring down her face, and she began stroking her and burying her face in her neck. "You have no idea what this means to me, finding my best horse in the world," she said, handing me a large wad of cash for my trouble. "I don't want your money," I said, "but there is something you can do for me, with no questions asked, and that is my condition." "You name it," said Mrs. Jenkins, "and I will do it for you, with no questions asked," she said teasingly. "My mother's red Mustang is parked in the long, lonely road, and it needs petrol. Could you fill it with petrol and drive it back here, and park it back in our drive before my mother gets back home?" I handed her over the keys. "If you do this, you'll be getting me out of a whole heap of trouble." "Oh, I see," said Mrs. Jenkins, laughing. "Consider it done, dear," she said, tapping her nose as if to say, "This is our little secret." To cut a long story short, Mrs. Jenkins was true to her words, and my mother's car was firmly parked in the bay, no worse for wear, and when my mother returned home, nothing looked at all out of place. It would seem that my aunt's health had radically improved, and she was well on her way to making a swift recovery, although the doctors were still unable to make a diagnosis on her mysterious, strange illness. A week or so later, my mother bumped into Miss Ivor Miller in the local store, and Miss Miller looked at my mother's trolley, stocked with healthy food, and grinned at her like a Cheshire cat. "It must be tough keeping up appearances, Jenny. But you're not fooling anyone," she giggled. "I know you have a sneaky little chocolate addiction, and I understand, believe me, I do, but I do think it's a bit hypocritical, if you don't mind me saying so, telling all your clients to never indulge in anything naughty, when surreptitiously behind closed doors you are clearly tucking into all kinds of naughty stuff yourself when nobody is looking. And worse still, you're getting your daughter to buy you the stuff, so no one will be any the wiser. But I'm on to you, Jenny, and you're not such a saint after all." "I don't know what you're talking about," my mother had said. "Do you think I bought all that baloney your daughter told me the other day? Well, it was last Saturday, I think, about you having a migraine headache. Of course I didn't. I'm not so naive. I know she was buying those chocolates for you." "Sorry, I don't know what on earth you're talking about," said my mother. "I wasn't here last weekend. I was taking care of my sick sister." "Well, I saw you myself," said Ivor. "You were hiding in your red Mustang that was parked under the oak tree. So lie to me all you like, Jenny, but I know what you were up to." "You must be mistaken," my mother had said, shaking her head. "I definitely wasn't here. You must be confusing me with someone else." Ivor laughed. "You're good, Jenny, but you don't fool me one bit." When my mother returned home, she asked me if I knew what Ivor was talking about. "No," I said, furrowing my forehead, looking very puzzled. "I mean, you were away, Mum, on Saturday. You were looking after your own sister. If you ask me, Ivor must have her wires crossed." "My thoughts exactly," said my mother. "Maybe the woman is finally losing her marbles." So there you are. That's my story, about being stuck on the long, lonely road and encountering an anomalous creature I now know all these years later fits the perfect description and profile of a Bigfoot. Whether he was actually reaching out to help me or American Pie, I don't know. Maybe he was helping the both of us, but I'm grateful for his help, because I ended up getting home sooner, and I got away with joyriding in my mother's car without her ever learning about what I got up to. Sadly for my mother, thanks to Ivor Miller, there were whisperings and mumblings around town that my mother had a secret chocolate addiction, but it made her more human in the eyes of all her clients. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, What a fabulous story. Tell me if any of you have got a little addiction that you just love, whether it's a chocolate or a biscuit or a cookie that you can't do without. Let me know about it. Until next time, goodbye and good night.